Hi, this is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. Hope you enjoyed this Critical Thought, a detailed discussion on game design, and be sure to subscribe and you can pitch future Critical Thought topics. Alright, for today's Critical Thought, we're returning to the topic of presenting the best foot forward for your game, and what that means in terms of level and tutorial design. Over the last few weeks, I've had the chance to play several games, each with differing opinions or differing starts. And this is one of the big things I notice a lot of independent developers tend to have trouble with, and that is putting their best foot forward in terms of a game. And in an earlier topic, we talked about one of the key philosophical differences between an indie development versus a AAA. Indie games tend to be more about a unique experience or design, not so much about a refined one, while the reverse is true of AAA. We have games with mechanics and systems that have been refined to the point of giving the player, the best experience that it can be, but it's something that we've probably seen before in some way, shape, or form. But nevertheless, it's very important from a design point of view to always have the absolute best first impression that you can make for a game. It doesn't matter if your game has 500 hours of content if people get fed up after 30 minutes. And we've talked about this before, but for me, I have the 15-minute rule. Does your game annoy me in the first 15 minutes of play? That doesn't mean being frustrated or confused. I mean being outright just getting angry at your game for one reason or another. And if your game does that at any point, that's it for me. And we've talked about this before with just the sheer number of video games being released these days. It's not like the old days where you play a game and that's it for a good month to month and a half. And this is why getting the beginning of your game off on a good start is so important. And when we talk about games like this, there's typically three kinds of openings that I've seen, and this is dependent upon the genre and the design of the game. So the first one is basically the opening act. What are you going to be doing as soon as you hit the start button and you begin a new game? This can be everything from the Demon's Souls tutorial, Super Mario World 1-1, and even something like the openings from Half-Life and Half-Life 2. In this case, the opening or the first 15 minutes of your game is going to be a combination of story and tutorial. The player should be given a good idea of what they're going to be doing in the game while still presenting some kind of plot or an idea of what's going on. And this presents its own unique challenges. As we've said, when you're trying to combine story and gameplay in such a way, it can become a challenge to give both equal measure. Now, in an earlier Critical Thought, we've talked about the idea of an organic tutorial, as in the level design is built in a way that it teaches the player while still moving the player through it without having to slow things down or put up any messages. And the aforementioned Half-Life, Demon's Souls, and Mario are brilliant examples of that. Now, with something like Demon's Souls, we can actually extend that to World 1-1, and how the game properly gated the challenges and the expectations through the level. You start off and you're just fighting one random, undead dreg. As you go through it, you start to fight more of them. Long-range enemies are introduced. You have traps, the knights, and the level culminates with, of course, running through the bridge while the dragon's attacking you, and then, of course, the final fight. And all throughout this point, you're basically being trained, in a trial by fire, in a manner of speaking, as to what Demon's Souls is all about. In Super Mario, for instance, you have something very similar with the World 1-1. Everything's presented organically, and the rate you get through the level is measured by how skilled you are. If you've never played a Mario game before in your entire life, that level's going to probably take you a little bit longer, as you basically are going to get stuck at each new obstacle. For someone who's played platformers for a living, you can basically speedrun that entire level, and there have been speedruns through that game, of course. Now, the next type of opening is the pure story one. This is when a game will open up with basically the explanation of the plot and maybe a little bit of gameplay. This is typically seen in RPGs, adventure games, and more. And I have two really good examples of kind of the different ends of the scale. So the first one is, and I got to pull up my email here. This was a game that I got a press copy for from Atlas. And I am not going to pronounce this right, by the way. Utawa Rumono, Mask of Deception. And according to the description that I got, this is a very fluid and amazing SRPG combat. Unfortunately, I don't know what that is because when I played the game, I never got to see that. In the first 15 minutes of the game, there was no gameplay. And I don't mean that hyperbole. I mean, the first 15 minutes was literally me pressing X to continue dialogue. So all I know about this game from playing 15 minutes of it is that my guy has amnesia, there was a mantis monster, the mantis monster was eaten by a blob monster, who then turned into a high school girl. And I'm not kidding with that. That's the entire scope of the first 15 minutes of the game. And then there's followed by an opening cutscene. And also, to make things worse, those first 15 minutes were unskippable. So all I had to do was just sit there and press X. And here's the best part about this. I know this was exactly 15 minutes of play because as soon as that cutscene rolled, I got an achievement for beating the first chapter of the game. Now, this is what we see from a lot of JRPGs and RPG games in general that basically front load things with exposition. If you watch my play of Regalia of Men and Monarchs, it also does something very similar with just hitting you over the head with exposition. Now, in this case, getting around this is a combination of having smart writing and sometimes as simply as being able to skip. For instance, with Persona 5, the game starts off with a very stylish opening scene, the story pulls you in, and if you're not interested, you can fast forward through the majority of the dialogue. That's also really great if you're just in it for the gameplay. Now, the opposite example of this is from the adventure game that I played, The Last Door, that was recommended to me by El Gordo. And with The Last Door, this is a Lovecraftian adventure game broken up into different chapters. And the whole game is done in a very rudimentary, pixel art style. But the game opens up, and what they do that I thought was a very clever narrative point is that each chapter starts with a scene that looks completely out of place. So you don't know who's talking, what's really going on. And then that kind of becomes revealed over the course of that chapter. So the first chapter of the game begins with you basically playing a guy who's setting up to hang himself in his attic. And it ends with him obviously committing the act, the title screen plays, and then we're playing someone whose job it is to investigate the murder. To investigate the suicide. And that's a really great way to pull the player in. We're presented with a unique mystery, we get the stylized intro, and now we have to actually figure out what we just witnessed. Now, the third kind of introduction to a game, and probably one of the harder ones, is tutorial focus. If the first group were a combination of gameplay and story, the second were story focus, this is entirely gameplay. And we typically see this in strategy and action designs. And 1 second, I'm noticing some lag there. There we go. And when we have these kinds of experiences, the challenge becomes about trying to pretty much teach the player what you're doing in the 15 minutes of play without getting them to feel either overwhelmed or not presenting enough information. And as we have talked about many times before, there is a lot that goes into a strong tutorial. And the game that I played that was unfortunately not a good example of this is this title called Logistical. And what's really sad is that a friend of mine recommended this as a really great strategy game. But this goes back to what I said at the start. It doesn't matter if your game has 100, 200, 300 hours of content if people are getting frustrated within the first 20 to 30 minutes. And that's what happened to me. with the combination of a very confusing tutorial, some really weird UI and control issues, and just find myself just trying to, like, I guess, push buttons and make things happen, just made me bounce off the game within that span of time. And that is, again, something that you really want to avoid. And I'm trying to speed through this because we're about 10 minutes into this video, and if I'm not careful, we can easily hit 20, 30, 40 minutes if we start getting full on about tutorials. But the moral for today's critical thought is an adage that I've heard this for a while now, and it's as true as it was back then as it was now. And that is, you should always design the first part of your game as the last thing that you do with your title. It's okay to start or have a stage 1 or a tutorial during development or early access, but typically you want to go back and give it a second or even a third pass when you're about to release the game. And the reason, of course, goes back to what we've been saying over the last 11 minutes, and that is a strong opening can do so much to get someone invested in your game. If people are feeling annoyed, frustrated, bored, confused 10-15 minutes in, why should they stick around for an hour, 5, 10, and so on? And some of the games that I've enjoyed the most over the last few years have been those with a really strong opening. The opening may only be the 10-15 minutes, but if you can hook someone for that entire length of time, there's a good possibility they're going to stick around for the long haul. As I've played games like Monolith, The Binding of Isaac, Renowned Explorers, Soulsborne, and again, I could just keep naming titles. But for designers watching this, it's very important when everything is all said and done, when you have your entire gameplay loop and mechanics mapped out, to then go back and look at the first 15 minutes. What is someone going to be doing when they load up your game for the first time? And how do you present it as accessible and as easy to understand as possible? Be it through an opening level, cutscenes or story, or a tutorial. Because those three are going to make or break that opening of your game. And sometimes we've seen titles that just pretty much throw the player in. Recently, I played Tormentor X Punisher, which the cutscene doesn't really give us any gameplay advice. We're put into a tutorial that teaches us shoot, move, kill, and go. And sometimes that's all you need. Again, the tutorial or your opening is really going to be dependent on your game systems in question. A game like Stellaris or Europa Universalis is going to have a much greater or much more involved tutorial or opening compared to something like Super Meat Boy. But with that said, we're going to wrap things up here. Thank you so much for watching today's Critical Thought. If you're new, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Let me know if you have any suggestions for future Critical Thoughts. I hope you don't hear the phone ringing next door, but it's too late to edit it out here. And check back daily for more design discussions here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Until next time, have a great night. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And come back around 10 Eastern for regular streaming. For a collection of my writings as well as weekly podcasts on game development, be sure to check out game-wisdom.com. Follow me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day. And to help support everything that I do, you can find me on Patreon under GW Bycer or Game Wisdom. Your donations can help to keep things running, and when we hit some goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy. So, thanks again for watching, and be sure to come back for daily discussions on game design on the Game Wisdom channel.